When Captain America throws his mighty shield, all those that oppose his shield must yield, unless he's getting shady. Captain America is more than just peak physical fitness and an uncanny knack for winging a shield at dudes. He is the moral guidepost for the entire Marvel universe, in part because he's had to reconcile the ideals he thought he knew when he first went into the ice with the less than ideal modern world. But he always tries to do the right thing, even if it kills him. Except for those times that he doesn't. Who doesn't like seeing a good man break bad? Fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe know James Buchanan Barnes, aka Bucky, as the tall, once confident, now stoic oldest friend of Captain America. The one who was able to enlist in the army the normal way during World War II because he wasn't a tiny little dude with a list of reasons he shouldn't be sent to the front lines. With comic book Captain America dating all the way back to actual World War II, Bucky was a little different. See, Captain America made his first pre-Frozen appearance in a timely fashion in 1941. Get it? Because it was timely comics? Alright. During that time, teen sidekicks were all the rage. Robin, Jimmy Olsen, Wonder Girl, even the Hulk all the way back in 1963 had Rick Jones, the kid he shielded from the Gamma Bomb. It's kind of like, if you're not endangering the life of a minor, can you really call it crime fighting? So from day one, the Star-Spangled Man with a plan planned his missions with a 16-year-old complete with his own costume. Originally, Bucky came from a series of increasingly unlikely circumstances. After he lost his soldier parents, he petitioned to become a ward of the Army, specifically at Captain America's home base. After Bucky stumbled into Steve halfway out of his costume, Rogers made the logical decision to train the kid and adopt him as his sidekick, 'cause naturally. We would later learn, through the magic of this thing called retcon, that the story was just that, a story. The story of the plucky Bucky palling around Europe giving the Axis what for was good counter-propaganda to the Hitler Youth. But it was also a cover for Bucky's real mission, to do all the shady stuff winning the war demands they didn't want their symbol of American nobility doing, such as morally ambiguous acts. This is not so much something Cap didn't know about, but rather something he turned a blind eye to. So on top of having a non-super soldiered 16-year-old in the largest industrial war in history, he was already having him do soul-darkening stuff long before he became the Winter Soldier. Hindsight sometimes can paint seemingly noble actions in a less than noble light. Early on, Thanos seemed to be making a fair point until you started to think about what his plan entailed and the fact that it would only set Earth back to about the mid-70s population-wise. Now, a lot has been written about Steve in the MCU, such as him using his time machine to return to his own time, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later, but for now, it's what he decides to do with Vision during Infinity War that I want to focus on. Knowing that the last Infinity Stone Thanos needed to complete his set was embedded in Vision's forehead, Vision offered to have it destroyed to deny Thanos a full gauntlet, which would force him to do his half of everybody plan planet by planet once again. Captain America, of course, Captain America, the idea of Vision sacrificing himself to save literally half of everyone everywhere by saying, "We don't trade lives." So he heads to Wakanda to find a brain big enough to extract the Mind Stone without erasing Vision, while he drafts the entire Wakandan army to protect Vision while Shuri does her thing, trading hundreds upon thousands of faceless Wakandan soldiers, all for the life of a 2-year-old synthezoid. But after all that though, of course, it didn't work. So he technically wound up saving billions of lives and didn't even save Vision in the first place. It sounded noble, but in practice, Vision was probably right. Perhaps the most notorious time Captain America wasn't on the side of the Angels, it wasn't even the real Captain America. Kind of. See, S.H.I.E.L.D. had built a secret prison that Steve didn't know about, but since he was now the oversight guy, he wanted to see it. It was a pleasant little Norman Rockwell town of former supervillains under the mind control of a sentient cosmic cube named Kobik, who had been corrupted by Red Skull, so when there was a prisoner revolt after some had gained their memories back, Kobik revived a downed Captain America, while also rewriting reality so that Captain America was a double agent for Hydra. The list of things this version of Steve did could fill this list entirely by itself. Highlights include killing Black Widow, killing Red Skull, hiring Deadpool to kill Phil Coulson, who even in the comics was a huge fan of his, and he also pushed his ally Jack Flag out of a helicopter to protect his secret. It was only his durability that wound up keeping him alive there. Eventually, everything was set right and all the bad deeds disappeared, but people remained split on the value of Captain America switching teams. While it doesn't have nearly as many blind spots as others, Cap's sliding scale between defying order to do what's right to just performing his duty is kinda messed up, actually. During the Age of X timeline, Charles Xavier never opened his school or advocated for mutants, and as a result, formerly in-control mutants like Jean Grey ended up leveling an entire city. This reality's Cap rounded up mutants at the behest of the government that ruled them as a menace. He wasn't doing it under duress either. In his series introduction, he points out that the mutants don't get it, not like real humans. That would of course be the guy with superhuman strength and speed. People in the Marvel world seem to be cool with superpowers unless you're born with them. Then you need to be contained. Apparently, that's a bridge too far. He even ended up shooting Mystique, but channeling some of his inner Captain America, he stopped short of finishing her there on the spot. After all, he is still Captain America under all that racism. While the circumstances and outcome between the comic and movie versions of Civil War are different, either version retains some core elements. The government wanted to register and license superheroes. Cap was against it, Tony was for it, and the former friends were calling up their mutual friends to get into a big ol' hero-on-hero fight. The narrative supports Captain America's position as part of that freedom thing that resists having people who intended to use their superpowers as a normal citizen with no arresting powers to fight crime initially seemed like a natural choice. But is it? He was more than happy to enforce restrictions against other groups and not just in Age of X. In the Avengers vs. X-Men arc, after finding out that the Phoenix Force was heading to Earth, instead of letting the X-Men handle it, he steps in and demands that Hope Summers be turned over to him. And when the X-Men, of course, don't do that, he starts a different hero-on-hero conflict. This time on the side of restricting those with powers because he doesn't think they know how to safely contain them. Turns out his efforts kinda went to hell as the Phoenix Force got split among several members. We don't even know if it was on its way to do any harm, so it's really all on the shoulders and his own sliding scale over who does and does not have to be held accountable, apparently. Now, debate has raged on about Steve Rogers' kiss with Sharon Carter in light of the revelations that she's Peggy's niece. And depending on how you view the end of Endgame, the relationship he eventually has with Peggy in the past, but Captain's future because time travel is weird. Is it weird to be kissing his own niece by marriage even if he didn't know that was the case? It's not the weirdest accidental all-in-the-family kiss movie heroes have ever had. Insert that scene from Empire Strikes Back here. At that moment, Peggy had died and Sharon wasn't a blood relative. Regardless of where you land on that debate, it's nothing to how freaky about it he managed to get in the comics. Before the story was adjusted because, time, Sharon Carter was Peggy Carter's sister. Instead of missing out on 7 decades, Cap had only been on ice for about 20. In that time, Cap's gal pal Peggy aged normally and ended up with a touch of the old amnesia. That's alright though, since Steve had moved on to Sharon Carter. But then Peggy got her memories back, including being madly in love with Steve Rogers, who didn't tell her that he's moved on and instead strings her along while continuing his relationship with her sister. When he does get around to breaking things off, he does it on the sidewalk from up on a fire escape because otherwise it would have gotten in the way of his moping. Of course, at that point, Captain America had just uncovered the leader of an evil organization trying to overthrow the government, was led by the current president, and started to realize that his role as a symbol of America might not hit the same with Americans of different stripes, so he sort of had a lot on his mind. That is not his only shady dating move. Regardless of the reality therein, Hank Pym has always been a bit of a prickly pear, and his relationship with the winsome Wasp has always been a little rocky to say the least. But for the edgy update that was the Ultimates, the dial was finally pushed all the way over to Hank Pym, serial domestic abuser. Naturally, this is going to be a thing that Steve will get involved in. Knowing that she's in that kind of relationship and therefore in danger, he lets her continue it, but ends up seeing her on the side. Just imagine what would have happened if Hank had gotten wind of that while Steve wasn't around. That relationship did come to an end, but not because of Steve, but because Hank felt embarrassed he didn't do as well as the others trying to unrage a raging Hulk. The end result is Wasp in anaphylactic shock from ant bites when she was tiny. Cap did track Hank down and gave him a severe beating, which saddened Janet because it turns out victims of violence aren't always keen for even more violence. Shocker. Any superhero's no-kill rule is ultimately a little problematic when you start to consider the collateral damage their fights create, not to mention the lifelong injuries most of the henchmen suffer in the execution of their duties. While Cap for the most part tries to avoid killing, his origin story is during World War II fighting the Axis and Hydra, where he's done things like trap or crush an entire Hydra cell in a cave. So, he's done some dark stuff. 2004 saw Cap with a new series and a new enemy in Faisal Al-Tariq. Al-Tariq is angry about American adventurism and the cost it's having on his people. To drive that point home, one of the groups he has attacked Captain America while Al-Tariq holds a studio audience hostage is a group of victims of landmines and unexploded cluster bombs. So you know, some people with some chips on their shoulder. Understandably. Al-Tariq at this point had actually strapped the audience with landmines dug up from his homeland and was set to detonate them live until Captain America did some mighty shield throwing. In the fight for the detonator, Cap ended up killing Al-Tariq on live TV. Then, being Cap, he turned to the still broadcasting camera to make sure that while he's called Captain America, it wasn't America that did that. It was him, Steve Rogers. Though in fairness, that was more about accountability and trying to reduce a pattern of hate and blame than trying to get away with the whole, he just killed somebody. Then there's that time that Cap beat up a big fan of his work. Granted, that fan is Frank Castle, otherwise known as the Punisher. Their methods, most of the time, are pretty much as at odds as they can get. And that is not something that's lost on the Punisher. For instance, when he found out that there are police officers sporting his skull logo, he ripped it off their cars, reminding them that they swore an oath. And if they were looking for a role model, it was Captain America. A scene that hits pretty hard, actually. Naturally, Castle was against the Registration Act, but is aware of what his involvement meant. When supervillains started enforcing the act, he decided to step in, rescuing Spider-Man as his audition for the team. He was begrudgingly accepted into the fold, right until he immediately shot the supervillains the Plunderer and Goldbug, who had hoped to join the anti-registration team. Steve, naturally, lost it and started wailing on Frank Castle, who, to make it a little extra dark, refused to fight back because it was mother-flippin' Captain America. He just kinda sat there and took it. In a strange twist of fate, once comic books stopped using their self-censoring guidelines known as the comic book code, comics were free to address more serious issues like addiction. Famously, Tony Stark had a dark bout with his alcoholism. Green Arrow had a landmark story arc where his sidekick died of an overdose. Cloak and Dagger were cursed with their powers that forever tied the two together thanks to dalliances with drugs. Stay off drugs, kids. Could make you a source of light or an infinitely empty void. That's an odd pitch. Then there's the time that Cap broke bad in the Breaking Bad way, accidentally getting a faceful of the semi-fictional comic drug ice, which turned the dial all the way up on Cap's need to give someone a beatdown. Completely wired up on ice, he started punching his way up the food chain until he found himself literally doing the chicken sounds at a club trying to call out the big boss. Once he got to the big boss, he started ruthlessly beating him until Daredevil showed up and tried to get Cap to be more Cap-like. So, he ruthlessly beat Daredevil before he eventually reached the Crash, all while looking like he had grown a patchy 5 o'clock shadow, the international symbol for been through some stuff. Listen, making her complicit and sneaking around on her sister while he took his sweet time to tell Peggy he had moved on is not actually the worst thing that Captain America has done to Sharon Carter. Agent 13 was tasked with keeping an eye on S.H.I.E.L.D.'s newest, greatest asset in Captain America Winter Soldier. Somehow she had kept from everyone she was founder Peggy Carter's niece, and he wound up enlisting her in his effort to take down S.H.I.E.L.D., or at least the part of S.H.I.E.L.D. that had been taken over by Hydra. Turns out he was only getting started with asking Sharon to act against her employer. In Civil War, he turned to Sharon to get his shield and Sam's wings back so they could stop Zemo and clear Bucky's name. The end result is that even though Zemo was caught, Team Cap was still fugitives for all the other stuff they had done. They wound up spending 2 years on the lam until a giant purple alien with a sweet rock collection forced the band to get back together. Kind of. The world was so grateful to have half of everyone back after they failed to stop that happening in the first place, they were more than willing to let bygones be bygones, even getting notorious assassin the Winter Soldier a pardon. Only Cap had seemingly forgot the jobber who had been helping him this entire time, the one he kissed, the niece to his first true love. She was left to twist in the wind, eventually becoming a crime lord in Madripoor, turning the difficulty all the way up to high. You would think that after making the Phoenix issue go from not a problem to war between superhero teams with one offspring of Scott Summers, you'd think he'd have a lot more caution dealing with Summers' children. Nope. At least not on Earth 930274, otherwise known as the what-if world that asked, what if Apocalypse had conquered the world? This found the mutant that would be Cable living in the Savage Lands, before striking out to take out Apocalypse, recruiting Wolverine and Molecule Man along the way, who got the training wheels taken off of his powers. After gathering a collection of powerful tools, Summers was able to defeat Apocalypse, but in true Cable fashion, he figured that he could go into the past and prevent this from ever happening. To prevent that from happening, because time travel stories rarely ever work unless you're named Marty McFly, Cap used a borrowed Mjolnir to end Nathan before he mucked with time. Understandable, but still kind of a bit of a jerk move. Another what-if scenario asks what would happen if the Skrulls won the secret invasion. After a suicide attack by Marvel Boy and Wolverine getting a hold of a Skrull-based legacy virus from Hank Pym, Spider-Man and the other scientists on the team were theoretically using it to form an antidote, but Norman Osborn, posing as Tony Stark in an Iron Man suit, let everyone know that while they were celebrating a job well done, that he had swapped it out for a virus that had killed all the Skrulls on the planet. Genocide, understandably, was a bit of a bridge too far for Cap, and he used his shield to decapitate Osborne before walking away. Just like with that previous entry, I can't really say that I blame Captain America, but it's still kind of a raw move. One of the driving relationships for Cap in the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been the since-childhood friendship with Bucky Barnes. So powerful is the friendship of Steve and Bucky that it actually winds up bringing Sam Wilson and Bucky together as well. Finding out that the Winter Soldier is Captain America's former kid sidekick who had become a legendary assassin was no less traumatizing on film, only in this case Cap wanted to spread that around. Where the MCU, Cap sends his buddy to Wakanda so he can peacefully break his conditioning, get the role of White Wolf, and also a sweet new vibranium arm, in the comics Cap just kicked Bucky into the deep end. Using a cosmic cube, he had just dumped all of Bucky's memories on him all at once. Luckily, Black Widow, who was no stranger to regret, was able to help him bring that all into a softer landing. Trauma, everybody. Okay, it's hard to argue that Cap hadn't earned himself a little bit of a retirement, but was not telling anyone that he was going back in time to live his life with Peggy really the best move? After hopping through time, he should have had some idea about how delicate timelines are. Plus, he then had to live through a bunch of history and not do anything about it, which is all kinds of messed up. And then of course there's the fact that the world is still in turmoil and could totally use their guiding light. Yeah, Sam is great, but he's no Steve Rogers. Even he'll admit that. Would have been nice to have him around, that's all I'm saying. When a character dates all the way back to 1941 and still most of his Breaking Bad moments are clones or alternate worlds, it's clear his main superpower is moral center. You can kinda see how Tony wasn't exactly particularly fond of growing up in the shadow of Steve Rogers.